Good afternoon to those who are participating in this plenary meeting. I will make a short review of how no-till started. In the early 70s, 1973, an expert, Rogelio Fogante, a colleague, was already showing that he would be the great teacher of no-till. With a manufacturer of agricultural machinery, they adopted a planter for no-till. And then the no-till system started. In 1977, the first no-till conference in the INTA took place with a group of colleagues. No-till, or direct seeding, it was a technique that was applied after the wheat crop, because there was an experience, but there was no research on including other crops. So they made a mixture of conventional tillage and no-till, but only on winter crops. 10, 12 years later, a group of growers in Venado Tuerto, in the province of Santa Fe, came together to create an association. That was 1989. And in October that year, with 21 growers and colleagues, we created the Argentine No-Tillers Association. In 1992, the first Congress was held in Córdoba. Our estimation was to gather 450 people, and we were able to call 750 people. So since APRESID's foundation, APRESID was founded with the intention to promote research and to disseminate and communicate the no-till system. Since then, the number of members increased significantly, the same as the planted area under no-till. So the turning point was really when the RR soybean started with glyphosate to control wheat. That was in the mid-90s. Exponential growth started then. Until now, we have the planted area in Argentina in 95%. Really now we have 90% under no-till, because there are cases of resistant weeds, and so some growers plow until their soils. Right now, no-till is implemented in monoculture, soybean after soybean. The correct thing is not to use no-till directly as a system, but rather do crop rotations and try to extend the life on the soil, to plant green. So to have a constant cover in the soil. That would be the ultimate goal of no-till. So this is my small 5-minute introduction. Now I will give the floor to Wade so he present his experience to us. So I'm just telling you what's APRESID today here. What's the No-Tillers Association in Argentina.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the kind introduction and the education on the history of Opera Seating the Association, the Congress as well. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak with you all today and relay some of our experiences and observations with the systems in Virginia and in the Mid-Atlantic United States. I begin with a slide that is actually a modern slide. This photo was taken 2 years ago. This is an Amish family, and their religious culture does not allow them to use mechanical conveniences. They can use tools that are necessary for the job, but this is their no-till system on their farm. Just, I guess, a way to point out that this works at all scales with many fashions. I wanted to first introduce the region where I work and where we're from. If you'll notice, the inset map is the entire United States with the state of Virginia highlighted in red. The two stars on the map represent, the northernmost represents New York City. The southernmost is Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. The state of Virginia is roughly highlighted within the yellow circle. So geographically, that's our location, just off the Atlantic coast. Virginia is actually made up of mostly of 3 large physiographic regions where agriculture is conducted. In the green, you'll see the coastal plain region. To the west of that, I guess in orange or pink, is the Piedmont region, a different geographic formation. Then you have the Blue Ridge Mountains, a very old mountain range, and then the Ridge and Valley region, which is a plateau to the west of that. The Blue Ridge Mountains being some of the oldest in the world. So each of those defines 3 very different growing areas for our producers. The Ridge and Valley region, beginning at the west, has an elevation of about 700 meters. The soils are highly variable. They tend to be everything from deep and very, very fertile clays to shallow soils formed over limestone. The slopes there can be quite steep, 2 to 12% in land that is still farmed. And the crops in this region are cool season grasses, maize, soybeans, and alfalfa. It's a large area of ruminant livestock production as well as poultry production. And so many of the crops in this region are used as forage for the livestock there. Again, moving to the east is the Piedmont region, physiographic zone, about 400 meters in elevation on average, so lower than the Ridge and Valley. In the northern part of this region, especially, the soils are derived from granite. They're red in color. They tend to be relatively high in clay. They are acidic because of that granite parent material, and they have inherently low organic matter. In this region, historically, reduced tillage has been practiced as a method to reduce erosion because of the slopes here. These are very similar slopes in that we're 9 to 2 or 3% slopes. And the grasses, the crops here tend to be grasses as well, maize, soybeans, wheat, barley, and also tobacco. Then next to the east, you have our coastal plain region. These are very deep sand soils. They're highly drought prone. They have very low clay content and tend to have low organic matter. There's reduced tillage in most crops in this area, and it's today, and it's less of a concern over erosion and more of a concern about moisture retention. So with reduced tillage and more cover, we have better water relations. And this area tends to produce many of the same crops, but in addition to that, we include vegetables, snap beans, potatoes, tomatoes, and those crops in this zone. A bit more about Virginia and to highlight some of maybe the differences and the challenges we face. This is a patchwork of what I would consider normal-sized fields and normal-shaped fields within the state of Virginia. You'll notice the yellow bar there represents a distance of 1 kilometer. So I wanted to make sure that we understood that in this area we have many, many small fields and many, many irregularly shaped fields. And you'll notice a number of dwellings and structures, so there's a large human influence there as well. A lot of people in the same area and landscape where we farm and conduct our business. Climate-wise, our growing season tends to be from around early April until the end of October for the majority of our summer crops. Statewide, we tend to have cumulative rainfall on average of about 70 to 72 centimeters. In the early part of our growing season, temperatures are 10 to 15 C. The same at the end of the season in October during harvest season, so not much different than yesterday. In the middle of the season, daily average temperatures reach 25 to 27 C. So a moderate climate for the most part within our system. Winters obviously colder, but this is our typical growing season. To give you an idea of our crop production potential, these are statewide average maize yields from 1990 to 2018. Looking from left to right, you'll see a progression of about a tenth of a megagram per hectare per year over that time period. One of the things to point out about our growing environment in Virginia, though, I've mentioned the propensity for our drought-prone soils. We have a significantly more variation in yields from one year to the next than many of our neighbors who have more productive soils might in other parts of the world. So I would direct you to years like 2002 and 2010 when our average maize yields were quite low, which brings down the average, but also points out the challenges of farming in the Mid-Atlantic region. I would also like to point out that we have I guess it's the world record maize yield was grown in the coastal plain region of Virginia with slightly over 40 megagrams per hectare. And so while we have many challenges, we also have an environment that can be quite conducive to extremely high crop yields when the most appropriate management is applied. And so we have, again, we have lots of opportunities in our region. We have also many challenges in terms of managing around what can be a difficult environment at times. Reduced tillage, direct seeding, is a large part of that because it, as the previous speaker alluded to, it allows us to buffer some of those differences in temperature and make them less severe. It also helps us retain more moisture, as you know. Okay, so moving from geography and a summary of Virginia to the history of no-till in the eastern U.S. I think many of us are familiar with the classic work by Faulkner in 1943 entitled The Plowman's Folly. At this time, this book generated a huge amount of interest in agriculture because his premise was that there is no scientific reason for plowing in and of itself. And he also made the argument that he felt like the plow had actually destroyed the productiveness of soils. Now, at the time, this was viewed as a very new idea. But in all actuality, the idea, the concepts of this had been around some before this groundbreaking book. In fact, our colleagues at the Ohio Agricultural Experiment Station reported on some studies conducted in the early 1930s, in 1937, and their conclusion on tillage at that time was that it should be held to a minimum just to meet acceptable seedbed requirements. So this concept, this idea, has been around for many, many, many years. The problem was in the practical application of those concepts. How do we execute this idea of reduced tillage or minimum tillage? So we come to a period of the late 1950s and early 1960s. This is a fairly typical Piedmont landscape in Virginia. with the combination of the soil textures and the landscape, there was a lot of concern about erosion because we had introduced commercial fertilizers and we'd moved away from a long-term rotation that included sod. And so we had limited the amount of erosion by our crop rotation up until the era of World War II or the 1940s. By the 1950s, our crop rotations had become less extensive, more intensive, with more inputs on fertilizer and thus more tillage and more erosion. So everyone recognized the need to do something different. And that something different was, in the beginning of this, a significant number of research and on-farm demonstration studies. So we had research that was conducted in Virginia on the Agricultural Experiment Station, first published in 1961, talking and discussing the possibility and deriving the recipe for planting no-till corn directly into grass sod, killed grass sod. And so those experiments were conducted in 1961. By 1962, 1963, the first well-documented on-farm studies were being conducted in Herndon, Kentucky, received a lot of acclaim and had great success. And the system really began to take off in 1966 with the introduction of the Alice Chalmers planter that included these fluted coulters. And so I think many of you are familiar with this technology, but this was adapted from some early research models that used something very similar with great success, but this was the first commercial production planter. By the 1967, this was available to growers. And so the first no-till double crop soybeans grown after wheat were produced in the state in 1967, 1968, and a report was published in 1968 actually demonstrating higher no-till maize yields compared to conventional tillage systems, contrary to what most people believed. So at that time, there was evidence that the yields could at least be maintained and improved, and this was due to advancements in planter technology. This is a figure that's extracted from a graduate thesis that was conducted in 1974 on the process of awareness and adoption of this no-till systems in Virginia from the 1950s to the 1960s. So you could see, I believe from the figure, a fairly consistent trend of awareness and then adoption some period later. And if you'll notice, the awareness and adoption were relatively low in terms of the percent of respondents until 1965 or 1966. At that time, we finally had the planter technology available to us to be able to implement this successfully. Now, I have to point out the involvement of Virginia Tech and the Virginia Cooperative Extension System in this early expansion of no-till in the state. There are 3 blue stars on this map. The one in the southeast is the Virginia Tech main campus. The one in the south central part of the state is our Southern Piedmont Research and Extension Center, and the one in the north is our Northern Piedmont Center. All areas where we conduct a significant amount of agricultural research and demonstration still today. But if you look, the numbers that are presented in these counties are the number of acres that were planted in no-till maize at that time. And so there were really 3 centers of adoption, and it's no coincidence that those 3 centers were around each of these education and demonstration systems. But the adoption was directly related to the ability for the farmers to hear about the technology, see the technology, experience it, and in this particular case, the engineers and the agronomists went so far as to build some prototype planters that they loaned to the farmers in those 3 regions for their use. And so they were able to actually experience it and experiment with it before they had to purchase the technology. One more slide from that era, because I found it interesting as I looked at this. These were the changes. This is a report on the changes that occurred within the operations through the adoption of no-till systems or direct seeding systems. They're no different than what you would find today. What producers said they did in 1965 was, with this technology, is it allowed them to farm more land. It allowed them to use less labor, and they had either no change in yield or an increased yield. Very, very infrequently did they have a decreased yield. So again, I found it interesting that these are the same answers that I would give in 2019 that were given in 1965. The next step, in addition to no-till maize, was to try to evaluate the cropping systems that this was most suitable for. So a number of cover crops, crop rotations, or planting order, and such were conducted through the 1960s and early 1970s with no-till systems in the region. And fortunately, the report concluded that crop rotation is truly unimportant if a suitable mulch is provided and weed control is obtained. And I think experience has borne this out for many of us, is that this direct seed production is suitable for many, many systems and many, many crops as long as a few minor conditions are obeyed. Now, for those of you who might have seen one of my colleagues speak earlier today, through the 1960s, 1970s, and even 1980s, we had a large uptick in acceptance of no-till seeding for soybeans and corn. We had much greater difficulty with production of no-till wheat or barley. Many reasons why. Smaller seed, so seed-to-soil contact is extremely important. The fact that the corn and the wheat share common pests in some extent, so disease could be greater in the wheat if that corn residue is present in that system and still there on the surface of the soil. And also the lack of appropriate equipment. Again, just as was the case when we had the first introduction of no-till planters with wide rows, the first few grain drills that were tried in these no-till systems were inadequate to cut through and that much residue and place the seed appropriately. So I'm going to move relatively quickly from that period through until the end of the 20th century. This is a report on statewide acres for conservation till and no-till. So in this particular case, the orange line represents the proportion of acres, somewhere between 30 and 35%, that were truly no-till, not disturbed, direct seeding throughout the entire crop rotation. Conservation tillage represents a different definition in that at least 30% residue was maintained on that cropland at all times. So that's somewhere between 40 and 50% of the acres in that time. So that's a snapshot of the very initial history, sort of the middle period of that. And here is a more modern snapshot of the system today. So working from the bottom and going up, this is the proportion of cropland in each one of these states in the Mid-Atlantic region that is planted with zero tillage. So at the bottom, you have New York, and then West Virginia, then Pennsylvania, Delaware. The upper line is the solid line would represent the zero-till acres in Maryland, and the small dotted line is Virginia. So depending on the state, we are 5 to 65% adoption of no-till, with the state of Virginia being reported as having the most. This is statewide, though, and if you look at our main grain production area, which is the very eastern part of the state in the coastal plain, a survey of 789 fields from 15 counties conducted about a decade ago now reported that over 90% of the acres in that region were planted with no-till systems, and so they had adopted that. So we have a discrepancy based on our cropping systems and our locations and our soils, which I think is common within most places, but much greater adoption in that part. There have been a number of drivers for this increase in adoption of no-till systems. One of them has been pressure from the environmental community and the policymakers. The Chesapeake Bay is that body of water that's immediately to the east of the mainland of Virginia, between us and the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Chesapeake Bay is unique in that it is approximately 50 kilometers wide, but only an average of 6 meters deep. What that means is that when excess nutrients are deposited into that water, there's no deep water for those nutrients to reside. We have significant algal blooms and algal reactions very, very quickly there. It is also directly adjacent to our nation's capital, where a number of people who have great concerns about water quality live, as do all of us, but they also have a lot of influence because of their role in the government. And so this watershed has been extensively studied and has been used as a model for other regions in the country on how to develop environmental policy and be successful in limiting the negative impacts of agriculture, many other industries on water quality. The second piece has been directly related to our on-farm production. So this figure represents two different soil carbon assimilation strategies. The dashed line, the one-to-one line, is the rate of carbon accumulation strictly with crop residues. The upper line, the solid line, represents the rate of carbon assimilation with that same amount of crop residue returned and no tillage. So what we learned after a few years of this research is that we could build soil health and soil quality faster if we didn't perform tillage. So that pushed farmers from the policy side, it pushed farmers from the production side. The next step, as was introduced a few minutes ago, was that we need to make this a more holistic system. The bottom line in this figure, the solid line, represents basically the duration, the amount of time that we can expect for soil quality improvements to occur just with the adoption of no-till. Said another way, our farmers learned that we could maintain our status quo with our cropping system, remove tillage, and we could continue to improve soil health and soil quality for 20 years. But then we would reach a plateau. The addition of cover crops, then, and additional biomass returned to that system means that we can increase the length of time that we can continue to improve soil health and soil quality out to past 40 years. Okay? So we began to understand that we needed to use these systems in a more holistic fashion to achieve the best effect. So now we have what one of my colleagues calls a never-till system in place in many fields, and others would call it a conservation agriculture system, where we try to keep something covering the ground 12 months a year. We try to disturb the system as little as possible, and we try to maintain a diverse crop rotation, and including cover crops, in order to be able to facilitate that green field year-round. We have conducted and hosted a number of educational programming and events. This one was a highlight that we enjoyed. The Conservation Tillage Information Center at Purdue University conducts a conservation in action tour every year. They visited us in Virginia in 2010, and one of the comments that stuck with me from one of our farmers who was on the panel, he was responding to the question, what one conservation practice is most valuable to your operation? And his response was, it's the no-till system, because it's made us more profitable. And so that's why it has stayed on the landscape in the state of Virginia. I wanted to share with you that we also have our own No Tillage Alliance Association that also has an annual meeting. So if you ever would like to come visit us in Virginia, the doors are open. We would love to have you come join us and spend some time with educating our group about the systems here. I hope we can extend that invitation fully sometime sooner. So that's the status quo. Education, training, policy incentives, profitability incentives. Opportunities for the future include a diversification of our cover cropping systems. We continue to search for those that are the best fit and the best mix for us to be most successful in the different phases of our rotation on our different soils. We search for those that allow us to begin our cover crop growth sooner in the cycle. We, as you saw from the figure of statewide temperatures, by the time we are harvesting in October or November, our soils, our air temperatures are averaging 10 to 15 C, so the season is limited for us to establish a winter cover crop. So we do things such as interseeding to try to establish the cover crop into standing soybeans in this case. We're also working with different strategies of planting into the cover crops. The previous speaker highlighted this in some of his work. This is a cooperator that we have in the northern part of Virginia, where he's planting soybeans into rye that's been rolled down with a roller crimper. This is a system that we're still not completely satisfied with in the state of Virginia. Our growers have been using a traditional spiral roller crimper on the left. We've also been experimenting with a multi-roller unit on the right to try to achieve better control. In our systems, most of our growers want to terminate these cover crops prior to the time when you could get best control with a roller. So they don't want to wait long enough in order for the cover crop to be mature for the roller to be truly successful. So we're trying to develop some technologies that would allow us to be more successful with that roller strategy and be able to use it earlier. The other thing that's a complication for us with this sort of technology, of course, is I showed you the small and odd-shaped fields, the road network that we have to deal with, and the difficulty of moving something that is 10 meters wide down those roads. It's almost impossible. So there's quite a bit of technological advance that's going to have to take place. And again, we're also looking at other challenges of, again, as Trey Hill mentioned, planting green, trying to come up with the best strategies, whether we need to roll, whether we need to plant into standing crop, at what point do we have to kill that. So this is the level of adoption of our most innovative farmers. Our average farmer is not anywhere close to this. And my role, and those of my colleagues, of course, is to try to move more of our clientele in this direction. We also have some other significant challenges in addition to managing our cover crops in that system, and that is manure management. So we have significant livestock in the state of Virginia, and there is a lack of compatibility between surface application of manure and strict no-till systems. We lose, the nitrogen volatilizes, and the nutrients from that manure are more likely to run off those fields if we leave it on the surface. And so, in order to try to make these systems more compatible with no-till, we're working with manure injection for litter on the right-hand side for poultry litter, and dairy manure on the left-hand side, working with various organizations to try to incentivize that so farmers can afford the equipment, and also, again, begin to see that demonstration, try it for themselves, and adopt that technology. Next, we're dealing with our nitrogen applications. So when we have significant amount of nitrogen of crop residue on the surface, we run the risk of nitrogen immobilization. Our standard system in corn, for example, would be to apply 2/3 of the total nitrogen as a side dress. So when the corn's 30 centimeters tall, we would dribble nitrogen down the middle of the row as in a liquid form. We are trying to improve the efficiency of that application, reduce our ammonia volatilization, and reduce our immobilization by injecting nitrogen underneath that residue and directly into the mineral soil. So, and yet another adoption of technological advance. Two more things that I want to mention that I feel like are potentially in our future. This is an example of a fairly common occurrence that you would see in a field in Virginia. This happens to be a field map of my colleague Paul Davis on his farm. But if you'll notice, the red band that extends most of the way around the outside of the edge of that field represents low yields. And we know that exists. Those are field boundary effects from shading, from competition, from compaction. But there are also some low areas of low performance closer to the center of that field. Okay? And after some analysis, what we've found is that there are some areas in those fields that continue to be low performing and unprofitable throughout multiple cropping cycles. So on the areas around the outside, our typical strategy has been to reduce inputs. Less seed, less fertilizer. We know it's not going to be as productive, so we reduce inputs to try to make it more profitable. In other areas, though, that's much more difficult. And so we have a project where we have basically idled those acres of unprofitable, poor-performing cropland and put it into a short cycle, 1 to 4 years, of very high biomass cover cropping systems. So 2 to 3 cover crop systems a year. This is an example of a tractor going through and knocking down the summer cover crop. But the system here is to try to introduce as much biomass into that system, as much carbon into that system as quickly as possible in order to try to ameliorate the negative effects of the poor water holding capacity, poor structure in those sites. So this is something we're beginning to experiment with, this idea that we can use cover crops to return enormous amounts of soil to these no-till systems in order to improve areas with chronic poor performance. And also, again, this is another opportunity for us to learn how to advance planter technology because high maize yields and decomposing corn stalks are one challenge. This is a very significant challenge to plant through if we want to plant another crop immediately thereafter. And lastly, a piece that we've been working on in the very recent past has been the ability to improve our diagnosis of spatial availability of soil test phosphorus. So one of the things that we struggle with in our no-till systems is that stratification of soil test phosphorus in the top few centimeters because of that continuous application and the fact that the phosphorus binds with soil and stays in the surface. We want to do a better job in distribution of that and also to sort of even that out. So one of the tools that we're evaluating for this is actually a small plant, with the idea that we could use an indicator crop rather than a soil test to tell us what that phosphorus availability is, and at the surface and at further depths. And so we have sort of an interesting little plant which responds differently to different levels of soil test phosphorus. The leaf at the bottom left was grown under very low phosphorus conditions. Slightly higher above that, top right-hand side is adequate. Bottom right leaf is excessive phosphorus. And so it shows a differential plant response or growth response in relation to soil test phosphorus level. So our hope there is that we can continue to advance this. We can use remote sensing to monitor this, and we can create a much smaller scale spatial map of crop phosphorus availability through these kinds of tools. And again, I'm going to close with a promotion of another one of our extension and educational program, where we are really advancing this idea of improved cover cropping systems within no-till systems through what we're calling the Virginia Cover Crop College, where we're working to train the trainers in an effort to make sure that all of our colleagues are on the same page, speaking the same language, and advocating for the same things for these improved systems. So, thank you very much.
Le agradecemos a Wade Thomason.
Thank you very much, Wade Thomason, for your presentation. Now we will start with the Q&A sessions. We will be moderated by Thomas Milatis. The first question, Wade, thank you very much. I was about to ask this question, but it ended up coming from the audience. What is the percentage of no-till acreage in all the agricultural area in United States?
Nationwide, the answer is about 35%.
El 35% de todo el país está bajo siembra directa.
¿Es bajo sistema completo de siembra directa o?
It's completely a no-till system, or it is a technique that includes rotations. How is it?
That number represents strictly no-till planting, or direct seeding.
Estrictamente siembra directa.
Yes.
Entendido, lo mismo que aquí.
The same as in Argentina. The percentage is general no-till acreage. The next question has to do with crop yields. What is the average yield or maximum yield do you get in soybean, wheat, and corn in Virginia or in other states in United States?
Virginia, our soybean yields tend to be on average 4 to 5 megagrams. Wheat yields in that same range of 5 megagrams on average for the state.
¿Eso qué sería?
What by hectare, kilos per hectare. This is the way we measure it. Could you please express it that way?
Yes. So 4,000 to 5,000 kilograms per hectare of soybeans and 5,000 kilograms per hectare of wheat.
Trigo.
Wheat. For wheat, and what about corn?
10,000 kilograms.
10.000 kilos. Exacto. Bueno. Una pregunta, luego de lo que vimos, mi pregunta estaría referida a los sistemas de en cuanto a las abrasuras.
Talking about disc openers, are you pleased with the double disc openers?
Sometimes.
A veces sí.
If we do a good job of managing the soil conditions at large, yes, they do a good job for us. So if the moisture conditions are not too wet or too dry, I feel like they're completely adequate for us. It's when we have to or try to operate outside that realm of where soil moisture conditions are sort of ideal. We get too wet or too dry, that's when we have issues.
Condiciones de humedad que están fuera de lo ideal, en una de esas no lo podría contestar tan claramente.
¿No cree usted que habría?
Don't you believe that we should develop new systems vis-a-vis disc openers?
I absolutely do. One of the challenges that we face, at least in the U.S., is that the major manufacturers of our planter equipment don't really see a financial incentive in fine-tuning the extra parts, the disc openers, the trash wheels, the closing wheels, for all the different conditions that we put these planters into. They like to manufacture one consistent unit and sell it to everyone. And I feel like that we have a number of aftermarket manufacturers who do a good job with that, but the growers themselves are left to try to sort through that and work through the best equipment that works best for them. And so it's very much a trial and error on an individual or small group basis, and we could do better.
Did you have any experience in the cross-lot system? Do you have any experimenting with that?
Yes, we have worked with the cross-slot system a little bit. My personal experience was it was no better in terms of success than what we had with our current double disc systems. But again, we're mostly working in very sandy soils as well.
Quizás se puede utilizar con éxito en suelos arcillosos y arenosos.
Bueno, la pregunta me dice si la pregunta va relacionada al porcentaje.
This question has to do with the planting percentage of no-till percentage. That 35% is accounted for because the soil is frozen, or is there some other explanation why adoption is not higher?
Many reasons for that. One is the fear of the unknown. The second is the perception or reality of the need for new equipment or a different level of management that maybe growers might not be equipped for. Some areas of the U.S. have soils that are cold, and so that are very challenging to plant into because of that low temperature in the springtime. And so those areas, it's difficult to convince growers there that they would want to cover the soil and keep it cooler. Other soils, heavier textured soils and clays in our region tend to be less favorable for no-till. You have some crops, potatoes, peanuts, tobacco that make it very difficult to use no-till systems, if not impossible. And then we have, I mentioned the manure management issues, but areas and systems where we have to have surface application of manure is also a difficult situation.
De contacto del estiércol generan dificultad y hacen que la situación no sea tan sencilla.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Wade, thank you very much for this excellent overview that you just give to us, has given to us in the United States. I just want to leave you with this message. In the early 80s, Shirley Phillip from the Kentucky University, when she came to present her book, Agriculture with No Tillage, in the University of Buenos Aires, and I saw him again in Brazil. I think that this message closes perfectly your presentation. He said, the limit of no-till is imagination of man. Thank you. Wade, excellent.